There's real commotion in Moscow. On the morning of August 25, a US Air Force Boeing C-17 military transport plane landed at Moscow's Vnukovo airport. This was reported by Flight Radar 24. The Kremlin has already stated that they do not have any information about the American military plane that arrived at Vnukovo. And supposedly they're not expecting any guests from the United States of America, let alone the landing of a heavy military aircraft. What makes this event even more ominous is the fact that just a few days earlier, about 50 different NATO planes were circling around Kaliningrad, practicing jamming and destroying Russian air defense systems and missile installations in the Russian enclave. And after that, this entire air armada moved toward Belarus and then further into the Black Sea. And now a US military plane has been spotted in Moscow today. At the same time, there are rumors that peace talks are supposedly being revived right now, and that Witkoff and Kushner, Trump's envoys, were planning a visit to Moscow, but for now it has been postponed. On another front, yesterday there was information that representatives of the Vatican are supposed to deliver peace proposals to the Russians, developed by Ukraine, Europe and the US. But the most plausible version, it would seem, appeared even later. This is that Russia could have released another American prisoner, and that's what the military plane came for. Because the Americans have already done this. In 2025, they sent a military plane in exactly the same way to pick up their citizen who was being illegally held by the Kremlin regime. Or maybe it's a deliberate mistake. Well, a mistake in quotes, a NATO navigation error. So, let's break down this whole story. Why? Because there were a lot of different versions, but finally it became known who actually arrived in Moscow on that military plane. And when you find out who it was, you'll be really surprised. My name is Alexei Pechin. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I'd ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and later as we go along, leave your comment under this video.
See you. Let's go. The Americans have arrived for negotiations. And what about you? Have you made up your mind? Cars from the American ministry, and also news that a military plane has arrived. It landed at Vnukovo an hour and a half ago.
So, on the morning of August 25th, a US Air Force military transport plane, a Boeing C-17A Globemaster III, landed at Vnukovo Airport in Moscow. According to Western media, this is the first such American military aircraft to arrive in Moscow since around 2021, that is, before the war. No one, the Pentagon, the White House, the US Embassy in Moscow, the Russian Embassy in Washington, or the Kremlin, no one at all has given any explanation about what is actually happening. Well, the Kremlin simply said that there is no information and that no meetings with representatives of the US administration are planned for this week either. This is happening exactly at the moment when, according to Reuters, negotiations on Ukraine seem to have reached a deadlock, but both sides are actually discussing how to resume them. So, let's analyze this whole situation in detail, because there is also some discussion and certain questions about the landing itself. Let's start with the complete flight chronology, which we will reconstruct using flight radar data. I'll say right away, be patient, because the story is very interesting, and only closer to the second half of the episode will we reach the climax. But I wouldn't want to miss any details either. So, on August 19th, this aircraft, that same military plane that landed in Moscow today, was spotted in Charleston, South Carolina. Then this plane was transferred to an airbase, right away to Andrews in Camp Springs, that's in Maryland. And that's exactly where the presidential aircraft Air Force One is based. And that's also where flights for members of the US cabinet, high-ranking military commanders, and the president's special envoys are serviced. So at that point, it was already clear that this plane was moved there for a reason. On Sunday, August 23rd, the plane landed in Riga, the capital of Latvia, and spent 2 days on the ground there. And only on Tuesday, August 25th at around 8:50 a.m. Moscow time did it take off from Riga. The route passed through the airspace of Latvia and Lithuania before the plane crossed the Russian border. The landing at Vnukovo was recorded at approximately 10:04 a.m. again Moscow time. The Kremlin's reaction was notably neutral. The press secretary of the President of Russia, Dmitry Peskov, stated at a briefing that the Kremlin has no information about the arriving plane and the Russian side does not plan to meet with representatives of the US administration this week. By the way, here's another reason to question whether Dmitry Peskov can be trusted at all. Well, this is a man who lies at every turn. In the previous episode, we raised the topic of mobilization in Russia, and today Peskov said, "What are you talking about? No, this is all a Ukrainian ploy. There will be no mobilization." I gave you exactly the same quote that Peskov made a week before the mobilization was announced in September 2022. He said, word for word, "What are you talking about? Nothing is being planned. This is all a Ukrainian ploy." A week later, bam, partial mobilization in Russia. Today he says, "What are you talking about? There will be no mobilization." And now Peskov says, "We have no meetings with the Americans planned. We have no information at all that, just think about it." A US military plane is landing in Moscow at Vnukovo airport, and the Kremlin representative says, "We have zero information, we don't know anything at all." At the same time, a source in the European Air Traffic Control Service reported that the heavy transport aircraft was heading straight for the Russian state border right after taking off from Riga. That is, the route didn't look random or like it had deviated. It was direct and purposefully aimed at Moscow. The type of aircraft is unusual for a diplomatic mission because it's a C-17 Globemaster III. It's a strategic heavy transport aircraft designed for moving troops, armored vehicles and oversized cargo, capable of carrying almost 80 tons and airdropping personnel. For transporting diplomats, special envoys, or official delegations, much smaller VIP aircraft are usually used, for example like the Gulfstream C-37. The use of a heavy strategic transport aircraft instead of the usual VIP jet itself raises questions about the nature of the cargo or the mission. And here it's important to note an honest technical caveat mentioned by aviation experts, which points out just how much they try to cover their tracks. Initially, there were doubts about whether the plane actually entered Russian airspace at all, since some of the position data looked unusual. Most Russian trackers recorded the landing at Vnukovo as a confirmed fact. But still, many experts watching the entire flight said, listen, something doesn't add up. It's possible the plane was sending false signals to confuse people about its real location. And after that it became obvious that this plane immediately attracted very close attention. Because direct US military flights to Russia have been extremely rare since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. When the EU, the US, Britain, and more than 30 allied countries closed their airspace to Russian planes, and Russia responded in kind for operators from those countries. But still, let me remind you, some US military planes have landed in Russia after 2022. For example, in February 2025, a US Air Force plane was already being tracked at Vnukovo. At that time, it was during a prisoner exchange that brought Alexander Vinnik back to Russia in exchange for the release of the American teacher Mark Fogel. By August 2025, a Russian government plane was being tracked as it was landing in Anchorage right before the talks between Trump and Putin. Well, and in February 2026, a Gulfstream business jet flew the Washington-Moscow route, which sparked similar speculation about the involvement of Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. And back then, Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, gave exactly the same answer. No information, no meetings planned. Later, we found out that Steven Witkov met with Vladimir Putin on those days. That is, the formula of Kremlin denial is repeated almost word for word, from case to case. Well, and such flights themselves have systematically preceded either humanitarian exchanges or diplomatic breakthroughs. And here, essentially, it seems we've come to the second point regarding a diplomatic breakthrough. Because information has emerged from a CBS News insider that the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, John Ratcliffe, has arrived in Moscow. It was precisely Ratcliffe's motorcade that was spotted by eyewitnesses in Moscow today, and there is no other information about Ratcliffe's visit at this time. Theoretically, Ratcliffe could meet with Sergei Naryshkin, his counterpart from the Foreign Intelligence Service. And I would like to note that the last time the heads of the CIA and the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service met was in November 2022. Back then, William Burns met with Naryshkin in Ankara, and it was reported that Burns warned Naryshkin against using nuclear weapons. Do you remember when Shoigu was calling Western leaders and threatening everyone with a dirty bomb? Well, and that was the period when the Russians were fleeing like rats from the Kharkiv and Kherson regions. So at that time they were hoping to somehow stop this retreat, and Shoigu was calling leaders and saying, "We will use a dirty bomb. It's about to start." Well, and at that time Burns was meeting with Naryshkin. There is no information right now about the purpose of Ratcliffe's visit to Moscow, but most likely we will find out a bit later. Insiders will definitely have the answer. So we'll keep an eye on it. I would add here that there's no need to worry that this is some kind of deal or conspiracy behind Ukraine's back. I don't think that's the case. Because Ratcliffe is a friend of Ukraine. And he is the biggest supporter of Ukraine in the current Donald Trump administration. I would even say more than Marco Rubio. That is, he is quite a pro-Ukrainian official, so he is definitely not going to betray Ukraine's interests. That said, here we move on to the second part of this episode. Now there's a direct connection to what we already discussed in the previous episode. Experts directly link the current mysterious flight to Reuters' reports that negotiations on Ukraine have stalled in recent days, and the parties are now discussing how to resume them. Let's recall what we already know. The Times reported yesterday about Zelensky's new proposal: a ceasefire, mutual withdrawal of troops, and the creation of a buffer zone. And this plan was developed jointly with Trump's team and the Europeans. And it was planned that today, on Tuesday, this plan should be handed over to the Russians. Well, reports said that it would be given personally to Lavrov, through a Vatican intermediary. At the same time, we also found out that the in-person visit of Special Envoy Witkov and Jared Kushner to Moscow was postponed. And the head of the office of the President of Ukraine, Kyrylo Budanov, warned yesterday, and I quote, "Negotiations prefer silence." So, the following sequence seems logical. Since the official publicly announced visit of Witkov and Kushner to Moscow is being postponed, and the Vatican was considered as an alternative channel for delivering proposals, which could have been, let's say, an attempt to confuse the public. While at that moment a visit by Ratcliffe to Moscow was already being planned. So this current, non-public, inexplicable flight of a heavy military transport plane with John Ratcliffe on board could very well be part of this attempt to find a communication channel, bypassing the stalled official track. And well, the final touch, the very geopolitical context into which the fact of the plane carrying the chief intelligence officer of the United States stopping in Moscow fits. And about the fact that he departed specifically from Riga and then from there flew to Moscow. The thing is, Latvia was already in the spotlight just a week earlier when we were analyzing large-scale NATO air exercises around Kaliningrad. With the participation of AWACS planes, EA-37B Compass Call electronic warfare aircraft. These are ultra-modern American reconnaissance planes. Artemis II reconnaissance planes which were operating over the Baltics near Belarus and the Black Sea. And now, the current C-17. This is of course a fundamentally different type of equipment. It's a strategic transport aircraft, not a reconnaissance or combat plane. And there is no direct data about its specific involvement in this particular group. As we have already tracked, it flew there directly from the United States of America. But the very fact that Riga has become a key transit point for the second time in just a few days in the context of Russian-NATO tensions. First as a base for intelligence activity around Kaliningrad, and now as an intermediate stop before John Ratcliffe's visit to Moscow. Essentially turns the Latvian capital into a kind of logistical hub for the entire current phase of confrontation and potential diplomacy at the same time. So there's a suspicion that very soon we will see some kind of breakthrough in the talks. Or I can assume that the Russians have started threatening the Europeans again. Well, basically they are already threatening them anyway, but with something bigger. And now they are trying to de-escalate the situation through negotiations between Ratcliffe and Narishkin. So for now, I'll leave it at that. Your opinion, your conclusions. Write in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.